Welcome to How to Write a Report. Some of you who are watching this might only be doing a results and discussion section. Some of you might be writing a full report. This presentation is going to go over every piece of how to write a scientific report. Generally, the rules for biology, although chemistry and geography follow a very similar pattern. So, there we go. Start off with the title. People tend to slough this off as not important, but I think the title is one of the most important things you can have, because if you're on Google Scholar looking for a paper, the title is the thing that catches your eye. People read the title, they read the abstract, they click, and that's when you get paid money for your article, is based on if your title catches people. So it needs to be comprehensive. It needs to actually explain everything that is in your paper, but it also needs to be succinct. You don't want to be super, super long. So my second year students frequently have wetland report as the title of their report, or radish report for my soil students. That's not comprehensive. You need to explain what your paper is about, a little bit more comprehensive than just radish report. So if you want the full marks for your title, you need to think about it a little bit more than that. And then start thinking about your author. So you are the author of your paper. Don't just write your name, put it in a formal format. You can have like your first initial and your last name, or your full first name and last name, include a middle initial if you want, add your school affiliation. So read, as you start reading real journal articles, you'll see the things that they do in theirs, and you should include the style of the paper that you might one day publish in. So if your research is in genetics, read genetics papers. If your research is in animal behavior, read animal behavior papers. So you see the title of the author, and then you see the abstract. The abstract is what allows people to know if they want to read the full paper. So it's literally a summary of everything. It summarizes your introduction, it summarizes your results, it summarizes your discussion and all of your conclusions, everything. Typically, it tries to be less than 200 words. Sometimes some journals will make it to 250, but the shorter the better, because you want people to read it and understand everything. So to do this effectively, I recommend doing it last. Write your whole report, and then at the end, read your report and then write your abstract. Don't copy and paste sentences. It's got to be its own thing. But it's easiest to write at the end. Your introduction, so this becomes a little bit more complicated depending on whether you're writing a short report for a second or third year course versus writing your major thesis versus writing your master's or your PhD thesis. But basically what the introduction is for is to give everyone a background knowledge so that everyone can understand the rest of your paper. So it's going to state your objectives. It's going to give all of the information that your reader needs to understand your report. So when you're writing your master's or your PhD thesis, your introduction is pages long. It's one of the longest parts of your report, because you're showing off all the things you learn. You're saying, okay, this is everything you need to know. But when you're publishing in a journal, your introduction is quite short because you're assuming everyone reading this already knows most of that background knowledge. So if you're publishing on salamanders in the Journal of Herpetology, you're assuming everybody already knows what a salamander is. And you're assuming everybody already knows the basic biology and behavior of salamanders because they're reading this article in the Journal of Herpetology. So for our courses, you want to give a little bit of background about the subjects that we're working on. So for my wetlands students, you want to give a little bit of background about wetlands and maybe about transect lines, and maybe about the wetland that you're studying and why you're studying it. Things like that. For my soil science students, you might want to give a little bit of background in the different types of soils that you're using, about radishes, about nutrients for plants, how plants take up soils. It depends on what your results are. If your results show that your plant is lacking in magnesium, then you might need to give in your introduction a background of what magnesium is and why it's important to plants. If your results show that your plants were lacking in water due to drainage, then your introduction might need to explain the different types of soils and why they're good or bad for drainage. Your introduction depends on what results you found. So sometimes I'll write an introduction, and then after I do my whole report, I'll go back and I'll tweak my introduction. It's also the first place you see references. So your literature cited is going to be all of the different scientific studies you reference. Your introduction is where you might start referencing things. So that background knowledge, where did that come from? You didn't just born with this knowledge. Where did it come from? Some things you can just assume everyone knows, but some things you need to reference. So, okay, let's move on. Methods. This again depends on your area of study, but you need it to be detailed enough that another scientist can reproduce it. So again, I'm going to reference my salamanders, but when I was trying to create my study and figure out how I was going to set up my salamander care and my salamander experiments, I read a bunch of methodologies and then was able to compare my research to other people's research because I mimicked their methodology. So for my wetland students, what kind of methods did you use so that other people, if they're going into a wetland, can have similar results? So you're running a transect line. That's a pretty standard operating procedure. But did you use 10 centimeter intercepts or 20? Or did you measure every single plant along that intercept, along that transect line? What kind of wetland did you use? That's important because other people are going to compare their marsh to your swamp or vice versa. For materials, depends. Not always are materials important. Sometimes that sort of gets pushed into other categories. For example, if you have an experimental procedure, like a chemistry soil assessment, you might put the materials in those. For chemistry, you almost always have standard operating procedures. You rarely have to actually write out every single step yourself because there's fairly standard, unless you're creating a new SOP. But for field projects like our wetland assessment, or like how you set up all your soils, your amendments originally with your radishes, that requires writing out. Those aren't standard operating procedures. You're going to have to explain some of that. The other thing that you might want to add to your methods, or you should add if you did any statistical analysis, which stats you used and how you used them goes into your methods. That doesn't go into your results. What you found from that statistical analysis goes into your results, but the analysis itself, the formulas you used, how you did that, that all goes into your methods. So for my soil science students, you didn't have a study area, but for my wetland students, you have a study area. And that should be included as a separate heading. You can include it as a subheading under your methods if you want, but most field ecology reports have it as its own separate area because it's important what study area you used. Because if like I was saying before, if I want to compare your wetland line transect survey to mine, I need to know, is your marsh beside a city? Is your marsh in the middle of the woods? How big is it? Different things. So what is the main forest type? What is the main soil type? Is it close to human activity? What sort of things do I need to know so that when I go to compare your results to my results, will I know that your wetland is similar to my wetland? So that's the basics of the study area. Now we're getting to the nitty-gritty. So the results and the discussion are the two most important part of your report, and we're getting into the more difficult part to do. Results shouldn't be difficult. You're basically just reporting what you found. So this is the big one, no interpretation. It also shouldn't just be tables and figures. You should have a written summary of what you found, and in that written summary of what you found, you then refer to by like putting brackets or words saying refer to or figure 2, figure 1, table 2. You can't just put the tables or put the figures. You need a written summary. The written summary doesn't have to be long, and in theory, you don't even need the tables and figures. You could just have a written summary. In my reports that you guys are handing to me, I want there to be at least one table or figure because I need you to show me that you know how to do this. We need to practice making them. Every table or figure should have a caption. That caption needs to be standalone. So if I was to copy and paste your table out of your paper and put it into my PowerPoint slide presentation, everything I need to know to understand that table is in that table caption. I don't need to read the rest of your report. And that's pretty hard sometimes. What else is in here? Yeah, you don't have to record all your results into tables and figures. Sometimes this is an example. One second, let me get out my pen. This is an example down here. I don't know if you can see. I don't have a laser pointer on this. But down here, this is an example of from my undergrad or master's thesis, I can't remember now, where my aggressive postures were very rare, so the results from them were quite small. So it was very easy for me to just write those results out in words. I didn't need a table. It was very distinctive. There were other results I had that required tables to show trends and patterns, or graphs to show trends and patterns, but this particular ATR posture is rare enough that it was pretty simple to just write it out. So I'm going to show you some figures. So tables, the captions go on top, so that description of what the table is goes on top of the table. I already talked about that should be standalone. You should highlight significance. So if you have any statistically significant or interesting data, you should highlight it in some way. Some people put it in italics or bold, some people color it, some people put little asterisks beside it. There's different ways to do that. Sometimes it's nice to have footnotes to reference certain things rather than making your table really complicated. I like to put my decimal points in a nice column. That's debatable now, the way that we have technology is sort of becoming less standard. You only should have 3 lines in your table, I'll get to that, and the units should go in brackets in your columns, as well as in your table caption. So here, for example, you can see there are only 3 lines, right? You've got the 1 line up here, the 1 line here, and the 1 line at the bottom. So you've got the 2 that are surrounding your titles here, your column titles, and then you've got the other one at the bottom. No other lines. There's no vertical lines whatsoever, and it's just those 3 horizontal ones. This particular one, you've got only the 1 unit is percent, and it's in, but you also have written it that their percent, they're defining that symbol in their table caption. Now they've used footers down here. This is footnotes. So rather than have another column saying temporary stream, permanent stream, lake, they've just added these little symbols. So that's sometimes you'll feel like you want to have like a subcategory. So if you feel like you want to put a second title in here, maybe you should be using a footnote instead. Figures are anything that aren't tables. So if it's not a table, it's a figure, which means graphs are figures, pictures are figures, maps are figures. It's not a table, it's a figure. The difference here is figure captions go under the figure. So the table captions are above, the figure captions are below. Again, they should be standalone. If you're showing significance, you can put error bars and asterisks and numbers on top of your bar charts. If you're doing a line graph or a scatter plot, then you might have to show significance in a different way. Don't connect the dots unless you have a linearly connected information, and I'll get into that. Here, actually, I'll show you right now. This is the one and only time you get to connect the dots, is when the dot are connected. So the data from this point is dependent upon the data from this point. So an example of this cumulative germination, just like you're growing your radishes, the height of the radish after day 2 or day 4 here is dependent on what the height was after day 3. The height of the radish at day 5 was dependent of the height of the radish at day 4. These are dependent upon each other, therefore you get to connect the dots. This is the only time, 9 times out of 10, you do not connect the dots in graphs like this. They've got their units in brackets in their headings here. Time and day, cumulative germination in percent, and they've written that out in here. Everything is explained in their legend. This particular website says legend instead of caption, but it's the same thing. Graphs, I like here it's pointed out that graphs are always starting at 0, 0. And this one has symbols that show up if it's black and white or color. Traditionally, all scientific papers were black and white. Now you're starting to see some color now that we have a digital age, but it's a general rule of thumb, and you guys should follow it, to use black and white. You want your figures and your tables to be able to be viewed in all formats. If people print this off, if you use yellow and their printer doesn't do yellow, you've all of a sudden, your table now or your graph is no longer visible. If someone scans this multiple times, you want this to be visible. Here's a bar chart. You can see the error bars. Again, they've labeled their different bars separately. They've got their units in brackets, and everything you need to understand it is in their table caption, figure caption below. So after you've got your results, you have to do a discussion section. This is the meat of your paper. This is probably the most important part and the hardest part. And the only way to get good at this is to practice. This is why I'm getting you guys to do this. The discussion is explaining and interpreting those results. So you're going to go through the results that you have one by one and figure out why. So if you found that your wetland had a lot of grass, graminoids, narrow leaf emergence at the first half, and then at the second half had all broadleaf emergence, why? Why did that happen? Is it important? Is it interesting? With your radishes, you are all doing different radish experiments. I have no idea what you're going to find. You need to figure out what your story is. What's interesting about your results? What did you find? What can you tell people? What interesting things did you learn? Maybe you found that shredded newspaper doesn't hold water like you thought it was going to, and all of your radishes were dehydrated with the shredded newspaper. But you put sawdust in another one and it did hold water really, really well. So that's an interesting result. All your radishes grew really well and they had the same amount of nutrients, but it was the water holding capacity that was the difference. That's the sort of thing you need to discuss. Why did you find the results you found? Maybe you found the other way, that the sawdust was lacking in nutrients. So even though it was holding water, your radishes weren't growing because it didn't have the micronutrients that were needed for the radishes to grow. So every result that you report in your results needs to be discussed. So this is a big one. Not every result you collect needs to be in your paper, because you want to collect as many results as you can, and then you can go through those results and figure out what's important. Of those results that you collected, what is necessary to tell your story? Sometimes you might collect a bunch of data and then not actually use it later. So only report the results that you are going to discuss in your discussion. And definitely discuss every result that's in your results needs to be discussed, interpreted, and explained. This is the other section. This is important. This is the other section that has to have references. So for every result you have, you're going to explain why you got that result. That explanation needs to be referenced some way. So you can say, I had more broadleaf emergence at the end of my transect line because the water table was higher, and broadleaf emergence are adapted to high, wetter environments, more water saturated environments. And then in brackets, you'd be referencing a paper that tells you that. I think this because these people had a similar result. So for you guys, it might all be stating old information that people already have published papers on this. To publish a new paper, you want to find something strikingly different. So it might not be, you might not know that radishes need more moisture, but then you can look at other species. So you might say, I think my radishes that I had in shredded paper grew better than my radishes that I had in sawdust because there was more manganese in the shredded paper. And then you can cite a paper where someone did the same experiment but with marigolds, and that's what they found. Because shredded paper has more manganese, as of Richard and Griffiths wrote in 1982. Discussions are hard. We'll talk about them more and more, but it's one of those things you guys got to figure out how to interpret your results, because as a scientist going through life, you're going to be collecting data all the time, wading through that miles of data you have and trying to find what the interesting bits are and then figure out why you found that data. That's what science is about. This part is the part that you need to practice and figure out, because that's how we learn new things, how we publish new papers. Okay, next. Literature cited. So all of those papers that you just referenced in your discussion, you might have referenced a few in your methods if you were referencing standard operating procedures, and then the ones you had in your introduction as well. All of those are cited in the body of your work, then need to be included in your literature cited. So there's lots of different ways to do this. You should choose a journal in your field. So if you're a geographer, pick one of your favorite journals and copy the way they do it in their literature cited. If you're a biologist and you're working in Dave Hackett's lab, find one of the papers in animal ecology, find a journal and copy the way they do it. There's so many different ways to write literature cited, the formats, that as long as you're consistent, I'm not super picky. So the one that I'm familiar with is APA. And this down here is how I would do this. So I've got the author's last name, if it's a solo author, and then their first initial. In brackets, I have the date of the publication, then I've got the title written out, and then the journal article in italics, and then the volume, pages. So if you're finding this online, I don't really care about the ULR. What I care about is the volume and pages and the journal article. So this gets a little bit tricky, and I'll help you guys through this. But no matter where it's been published or how it's been published, a lot of people send me URLs that have the Roxy Nipissing link in them because you got it through the library. That Roxy Nipissing link, that only works if you're logged into our library system. That kind of a URL doesn't help me. That doesn't help me find that journal article. But the journal, this information down here, the title, the journal title, and the volume and pages, with this information, I can find it. So that's more important than ULR. You don't need to have all your URLs, sorry. So by cited, I mean this bit. This is citing. So if I'm using someone's information saying like, I think that my radishes grew better in shredded paper because it's been shown that marigolds grow better in shredded paper because of the manganese. And then I would cite the author and the date of their publication. And then there's different ways to do that. If they have more than one publication that year, then you might start giving them A's and B's and C's and D's. You can add the author's title into the author's name into and say, I think this because Bloom said it, and then you can put the date in brackets, and then we'll know that it's his 2006 paper, and we can go check it out in your reference section, in your literature cited. If there's two authors, you put the last names and. If it's more than two authors, then you start using this et al. When you're citing, you use the et al. But in your literature cited, you need to put every single author. When you're actually in this part, you should have every single author written out. I don't want to see one author at all. You need, if there's 6 authors, all of them are written out in this part. Because if you're author 5 and then you see in someone's literature cited that you're just et al., that et al. Is for that citing within the text, not for the literature cited page. So they all should be alphabetized by last name of the first author, the lead author. And then if you have more than one publication, then it goes by date. So Jaeger solo 1980 comes before Jaeger solo 1981, and all of his solo publications come before his duo ones, and they're the secondary authors. So Forrester before Gurkitz, or Gurkitz. I don't know how to pronounce his name. All right, so I think that's everything I want to say about that for now. This is the website where I got those tables and figures. It has a lot of information about how to write a good report in biology if you're interested. And if you have more questions, please do ask me. Yeah, good luck.